Welcome, students, to the very last topic that must be covered in Chapter 1. On the very first day of class, we covered one of the guiding principles of anatomy and physiology, and that was the principle of complementarity. This idea that what something in the body can do is dependent on what it is made of, what it looks like, this idea that form fits function or structure equals function. The other guiding principle of anatomy and physiology is that the human body strives to maintain what we call homeostasis. Now, homeostasis isn't static. It's not the body always wants this and it never changes. It's a dynamic equilibrium. It is an equilibrium. Think about being on a balance board, right? You don't just stand on the balance board stiff and you have to make kind of these minute adjustments to make sure that you're remaining upright and balanced on the balancing board. And your body does the same thing in order to maintain a healthy, functioning, well-working body. And so we think of homeostasis not as static, but dynamic. And it's relatively stable. There are going to be fluctuations up and fluctuations down kind of internally all the live long day. But overall, the internal kind of body is going to maintain a relatively stable, kind of fairly stable condition, despite what may happen outside the body. There may be wild swings outside the body. We're going to talk about body temperature is a really good example. There's crazy swings in outside temperature these days, but your body gets to maintain its normal 37 degrees Celsius. Now, every organ in your body and all the organ systems contribute to your body's overall homeostasis. And so this is a topic that you must understand, because it does not go away throughout all of anatomy and physiology. And since homeostasis is kind of one of the leading causes, or often one of the causes of diseases, it doesn't go away when you get into your nursing classes either. So since this is a dynamic process, it's not something that your body does just kind of extemporaneously, kind of on the fly. It needs a pretty close coordination between all the body's systems, particularly with kind of the big brain, right, the boss of the body, the nervous system, and the endocrine system, which is your hormonal system, kind of constantly keeping an eye on all of these different kind of internal conditions, and kind of making adjustments as needed. So even though all the organ systems contribute, it's the nervous system and the endocrine system that are really kind of in charge of kind of monitoring these homeostasis mechanisms, and also actually kind of activating them, turning them on or turning them off, as the case may be. So every homeostatic response kind of control mechanism has three parts. That's the receptor, which actually detects what is changing internally, so it's the sensor in your body. The control center, which receives the signal along an afferent pathway from the receptor and decides what to do about whatever signal it is receiving. Those instructions are then relayed along an efferent pathway to the effector. And then it is the effector that actually carries out the instructions from the control center in order to have the homeostasis mechanism take place. So the receptor detects the change, the control center realizes that the change has occurred because it got that information from the receptor, and it decides what to do about it and tells the effector what to do. The effector goes and does it, and we go back to our homeostasis. And so you'll see charts like this, figures like this very often throughout the book with this kind of balance board dynamic to it. So what you see here in this image is, here is our stimulus, right? We have some sort of change in some sort of variable. That change is noticed by the receptor. The receptor sends the input to the control center. The control center receives the input, decides what to do about it, sends the output out to the effector, and then the effector carries out the response and brings the homeostasis and whatever it is, whatever variable that we happen to be looking at, back to normal. So there are two types of feedback mechanisms, what we call negative feedback and what we call positive feedback. Negative feedback are most of the homeostatic control mechanisms that your body uses. The response is always in the opposite direction of the original stimulus. So if the variable increased, then negative feedback would bring it back down. If the variable decreased, negative feedback would bring the variable back up. So negative doesn't always mean that the response is tamping down on something, but what it's doing is going in the opposite direction of what the stimulus was. That's what you saw in that previous image, right? The stimulus was up, the response was back down to normal. That's a negative feedback mechanism. And we're going to look at two examples here in just a second. One of them, which uses the nervous system, which is your body temperature regulation, and one of them which actually uses the endocrine system, the hormone system, and that's regulation of your blood sugar. So let's look at body temperature first. So let's look at the top half of this figure first. Here, our body temperature rises. We go outside, well, okay, not now, but we go outside in August in Georgia, and it's really, really, really hot out. Well, that excess heat outside starts to increase your body temperature. Well, when your body temperature increases, there are receptors in your skin and your brain that sense that your body temperature has increased. They send that information up to your brain, and then your brain goes and activates your, it says sweat glands, but it's supposed to be sweat glands. The sweat glands get turned on, you start to sweat profusely, the sweat evaporatively cools on your body, and that brings your body temperature back down. Now, the situation that we're currently in terms of our weather, is cold, right? So if you step outside now, with our snow on the ground, and stay out there with no coat and no shoes, then your body temperature will fall. Well, those very same receptors that sensed that your body temperature increased also sense that your body temperature has now decreased. They send that, hey, body's getting cold signal again to the brain, because in this mechanism, the control center is the brain. The brain says, oh my gosh, it's getting cold in here, and it then activates the effectors, which in this instance are your skeletal muscles, and you start to shiver, and those kind of little micro contractions of your skeletal muscles create heat, and your body temperature rises back to normal. So those are two instances where the body swung out of whack and some homeostatic control mechanisms kicked in to bring it back to normal and back into some sort of balance. If we look at a hormonal control mechanism, again, we have a kind of a similar, you can see the effector, the control center, all of that. Here in this instance, our stimulus is that our blood sugar increased. That is sensed by the pancreas, which then is its own both receptor and control center, and makes insulin. Insulin goes to the liver. The liver takes all of that excess sugar out of the blood, turns it into glycogen for storage, and that brings your blood sugar back to normal. If your blood sugar falls, again, the pancreas senses that, acts as its own control center, and produces a different hormone, which goes back to the liver, and now breaks down all that long-chain glycogen, turns it into glucose, releases it into the blood, and that brings your blood sugar back to normal. So those are two negative feedback mechanisms, one using the nervous system, that was the thermoregulatory process, and the one that's on the screen here, which is an endocrine system mechanism. But negative feedback If the stimulus is up, response is down. If the stimulus is down, response is up. Oh, excuse me. We also have some homeostatic mechanisms that don't function with negative feedback, but with something that we call positive feedback. Now, in a positive feedback mechanism, the response is in the same direction as the stimulus. So we get some sort of exaggeration or maybe some amplification in the response. And typically, positive feedback mechanisms are not really as prevalent in the body because they work a little differently, as you'll see here in just a second. And when you have to make these kind of constant adjustments, the negative feedback mechanisms, if it goes up, we bring it back down. If it goes down, we bring it back up, are just more efficient at this kind of constant adjustments that the body has to make all the time to stay in homeostasis. But there are some somewhat more infrequent things that occur along positive feedback mechanisms, one of which is labor and delivery, and another which is making a platelet plug and your blood clotting. So in the labor example, when a baby is born, the woman's uterus is stimulated by this hormone oxytocin. Well, the oxytocin causes the uterus to contract, which causes the brain to make more oxytocin, which makes the contraction stronger, which causes the brain to make more oxytocin, which makes the contraction stronger, which causes the brain to make more oxytocin, which makes the contractions even stronger, and so on and so forth. And we get in this kind of loop until the infant is born. And you'll see the same kind of loop, this positive feedback in platelet. So if you kind of tear a blood vessel, your blood starts leaking out, well, the platelets will adhere to kind of the damaged blood vessel, but then the platelets themselves release all these chemicals that attract more platelets, which then release more chemicals, which attract more platelets, which release more chemicals, which attract more platelets, which release more chemicals, and so on and so forth, and we get back into this positive feedback loop. And then the feedback loop in this instance will end when we have a fully formed platelet plug and you are no longer bleeding from your blood vessel. So that's positive feedback. As I mentioned earlier, and one of the reasons homeostasis is so important, not only for A&P, but for anybody going into a healthcare field, is if you have kind of long-term homeostatic imbalances, you greatly increase your chances of getting some sort of disease. It's also responsible for a lot of aging that we see. As we age, these homeostatic control mechanisms aren't as efficient and they don't work quite as well, and so we tend to have longer and longer imbalances, which makes us more and more prone to disease. Now, sometimes negative feedback mechanisms basically can't cut it, and in that instance, sometimes the negative feedback mechanisms basically quit and give up, and a positive feedback can kind of kick in and make your imbalance even worse. That's what happens in heart failure sometimes. If the heart is having a hard time pumping, it's trying to pump and trying to kind of increase what its activity if it's failing, but it can't. And when it can't, then positive feedback will kick in and drive the heart to function even more poorly. So understanding homeostasis and understanding control mechanisms and receptors, effectors, control centers, understanding how positive feedback works versus negative feedback, it is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly vital that you understand and kind of comprehend what is going on there, because this homeostasis principle is truly one of the guiding principles of anatomy and physiology.